They say some men carry their history not in medals, not in words, but in silence. The kind of silence that speaks louder than any story ever could. On the edge of a small town, one man lived that truth. Every Saturday he showed up at the range, not for applause, not for recognition, but for the steady rhythm of breath, trigger, and stillness. He looked like just another old-timer with an outdated rifle, until the day someone challenged him. That's when the truth surfaced, and respect was born. This is the story of a Vietnam veteran sniper, a man who carried humility like a second skin and left behind a legacy that no one could ignore. If you believe stories like this deserve to be remembered, don't forget to follow, like, and share your thoughts with us. Now, let's step into his world. Dust trailed behind the old pickup as it rattled across the gravel lot, the tailgate held together by little more than rope and memory. Frank Maddox always parked in the far corner, away from the regulars who liked to gather close, their voices full of half-earned stories and second-hand bravado. He didn't come for chatter. He came for silence and the quiet ritual that had been his anchor for decades. The man moved slowly but not weakly. Every step seemed weighed and measured before it touched the ground. Out of the truck bed, he pulled a weathered rifle case, worn leather, brass zipper dulled by years, no stickers or patches bragging about units or tours, just clean, scarred hide, carried with the reverence of someone handling a folded flag. His faded olive jacket hung loose over broad shoulders, jeans softened from years of wear, and on his head rested an old army cap. The fabric was frayed, the color sun-bleached, but it sat on him like it belonged, like it had always belonged. At check-in, he gave a polite nod to the clerk, signed his name in steady cursive, then walked to Lane 7. Lane 7 was always his. No one argued. No one tried to take it. Frank didn't make claims, but people somehow knew. They gave him space, maybe out of respect, maybe out of habit. Rumors drifted around about him. Some said he'd served in Vietnam. Others swore he'd been special forces, training snipers out west long before the wars changed their names. Frank never confirmed any of it. He never denied it either. He let people talk while he did what he always did, set up his rifle with deliberate care, like each piece of metal and wood carried a memory he hadn't yet put down. He wasn't there to impress. He was there for the silence between shots, for the sharp echo bouncing off the hills, for the slow draw of breath in the stillness that came just before the trigger broke. That silence was his companion, his only story worth retelling. But that morning the rhythm shifted. Tires crunched the gravel behind him, sharper, heavier than the usual pickups and sedans. A sleek black SUV rolled in, spotless under the pale morning light. Government plates. Out stepped a man in a tactical vest that looked fresh from the catalog, sunglasses wrapping his face like armor, gear piled high with gadgets and extras. Staff Sergeant Daniel Cruz, mid-20s, tall, clean-cut, the kind of man who filled space with his presence alone. His commander had sent him here for outreach, for visibility. These ranges were prime recruiting grounds, full of patriotic types and restless young men. Cruz figured he'd show off, make a little noise, and walk away with a handful of eager signatures. "Morning, folks," he called, his grin sharp enough to cut glass. He unpacked his rifle case with exaggerated flair, his GoPro catching every move, his voice carrying like he was back at base giving orders. "Let's make some freedom ring." A few of the younger shooters chuckled. Some straightened. That was Cruz's way, loud, confident, demanding attention. His eyes scanned the lanes until they stopped at 7. Frank was there, moving through his quiet ritual, loading his rifle with the patience of a man who'd done it 1,000 times without ceremony. Cruz leaned toward a local at his side, lowering his voice just enough to sound conspiratorial, just loud enough to carry. "What's the old-timer doing? Bringing that relic out here for nostalgia?" The local shrugged. "That's Frank. Comes every week. Always quiet. Shoots clean, though." Cruz smirked. "We'll see if he can still handle recoil without rattling loose." His words drifted across the lanes, sharp as gravel under boot. Frank didn't flinch. He didn't look up. He simply slid the bolt forward and waited for the light above his lane to glow green. Cruz took a lane two down from Frank, narrating his own actions like a showman. Wind from the left, light cross, textbook correction. He chambered around with a sharp snap, pulled the trigger, and grinned as his target returned with neat holes near the center. That's how it's done, gentlemen. Frank remained still. No bipod, no digital scope, no rangefinder. Just a bolt-action rifle, iron sights, and breath measured against the beat of his heart. His lane light flicked a green. He exhaled slowly and squeezed. Crack. The sound cut the air clean. His target slid back with one perfect hole through the center. He chambered another round, never pausing, never reacting. Crack. Another bullseye. By the third shot, the young man beside Cruz murmured, "You might want to stop talking." Cruz frowned, irritation tugging at the corners of his mouth. Frank kept going. 5 shots total. When the target came back, the paper looked like someone had taken a single punch through the same spot. One hole, impossibly clean, impossibly precise. The range had gone quiet. Even the usual murmurs of loading and adjusting seemed to still. Cruz pulled off his sunglasses, the smirk on his face frozen halfway between arrogance and disbelief. He walked down the gravel toward Frank's lane, every step slower than the last. "You shoot like that on purpose?" he asked, voice strained with forced humor. Frank didn't look up. He shrugged, wiping the barrel with calm efficiency. "Only when I'm trying. No pride, no boast, just fact." Cruz's eyes dropped to the rifle. Old, yes. Worn, yes. But cared for, steady, like its owner. Then his gaze caught something stitched into the faded canvas of Frank's rifle bag. A patch, small, frayed, but unmistakable. U.S. Army Sniper School. His jaw tightened. That wasn't a decoration you bought from a surplus shop. That wasn't a sticker for show. It was earned. The laughter in his throat died. The swagger drained from his shoulders. What stood before him was no relic, no old man clinging to the past. It was a marksman whose silence spoke of decades. Wars fought, lessons learned, lives taken and spared with the weight of a trigger pull. Cruz cleared his throat, his voice lower now. You go through Fort Benning?" Frank didn't answer right away. He finished reassembling the bolt, set it into place, and only then replied in an even tone. "A long time ago." The silence pressed heavy, and for the first time that day, Cruz felt the weight of respect he hadn't yet earned. The recruiter shifted his stance, suddenly uncertain in a place where moments before he had dominated the air. His sunglasses hung from one hand now, forgotten. The question he asked next came softer, no swagger left in it. "Sniper school's no joke," Cruz said almost to himself. "When did you serve?" Frank paused only a heartbeat, his hand still moving with mechanical precision as he wiped the bolt clean. 68 to 91. Cruz blinked. The words carried weight he couldn't mask. "Vietnam," he muttered, the noise in his throat stilled. 3 tours, Frank added, simple and steady, not for impact, not to impress, just as if he were stating the weather. His fingers traced over the rifle with practiced care, each motion deliberate, unhurried. Cruz's gaze flicked from the hole-punched target downrange to the old man before him. The perfect grouping, the iron sights, the steady hands that had made him look like a child playing soldier. He felt suddenly small, painfully aware of the noise he had made earlier, of the way he had strutted into this place like it was his stage. Frank zipped his rifle case with slow finality, the teeth of the brass zipper rasping against the quiet. The silence between them pressed heavier than any lecture. Cruz finally asked, almost without breath, "Why not say something?" Frank gave the faintest smile, one corner of his mouth tilting like an old scar. "Didn't think I needed to." He lifted the bag, slung it over his shoulder, and turned to leave. The gravel crunched under his boots, each step carrying away the weight of the moment. "Sir," Cruz called out instinctively, no longer the voice of a recruiter, but of a soldier speaking to rank he couldn't see but felt. Frank stopped, half turning. "What unit were you with?" The answer came quiet, almost reluctant. 3rd Battalion, 75th Ranger Regiment, attached to Mac SOG for a while, before most folks knew what that meant. Cruz's face changed, the arrogance dissolved, replaced with a raw respect that left him standing straighter. Not a salute, this wasn't the place, but something close, something weighted with recognition. Frank tipped the brim of his cap, not as acknowledgement, but as farewell. Then he walked back to his truck, same steady pace as always, leaving whispers behind him. The range stayed quiet long after he left. Men who had once traded stories now stood silent, replaying what they'd witnessed. The name on his lips spread like an ember. Frank Maddox, the old man with steady hands. Not a relic, not nostalgia, a living piece of history. The following Saturday, frost glazed the gravel, the air sharper, colder. But Cruz was already at the range before the gates even opened. No SUV full of noise, no GoPro strapped to his shoulder, just a plain hoodie, rifle case, and a clipboard tucked under his arm. The recruiter who once strutted now waited, patient, eyes scanning the lot for a dusty old pickup. When Frank arrived, nothing about him had changed. Same jacket, same cap, same slow, deliberate steps. But the air shifted as he walked past. People looked at him differently. They didn't stare. They watched. Quietly, respectfully. Cruz nodded as he passed. A small gesture, nothing loud. Frank returned it with the barest glance before heading to lane 7. By the benches stood a group of young men. New faces, some locals, some fresh recruits. Their rifles held too tightly, their shoulders too square with nerves. Cruz leaned toward them, his voice lowered. That man down there, he said, pointing toward Frank, could outshoot most people I've ever met. 3rd Battalion Rangers, Akvasog back in the day. One of the younger men blinked. Wait, like real black ops? Cruz gave a single nod. You don't ask those guys for stories. You watch, you listen. Frank slid into position at his lane, chambering rounds with the same rhythm as before. 3 shots cracked through the morning. The targets returned, tight, perfect. No one spoke, not even Cruz. This time when the recruiter walked toward him, it wasn't with swagger. It was slower, measured, his voice carrying only humility. Sir, Cruz said, standing just outside the lane, if you don't mind, would you give the kids a few tips? Frank looked at him for a long moment, silent. The air held steady between them. Then, without ceremony, he set his rifle aside and stood. Not much to it, he said, voice quiet but carrying. He took a stance, shoulders square but relaxed. Breath in, slow exhale. Don't yank the trigger. Coax it, let it break on its own. He picked up a recruit's rifle, adjusting the stock slightly. Your shoulder's off by half an inch. You'll pull left every time. The young man nodded quickly, eyes wide. Frank passed the rifle back, moved to the next, correcting posture, guiding hands. Not barking orders, not preaching, just gentle, practical adjustments, the kind you only learned after years of carrying steel under fire. The recruits listened, drinking in every word. Cruz stood back, silent, watching the transformation unfold. No one called him old man anymore. He was teacher, mentor, quiet master of a craft that required no boasting. By the time Frank packed his rifle back into the worn case, 3 of the young men had asked if he'd be back next week. Their voices carried no challenge, only hope. As he walked past, Cruz stood straighter, nodding once with weight. Thank you, he said, not as recruiter, not as showman, but as soldier. Frank paused, his reply just as simple. Just doing what someone once did for me. Then he left again, without noise, without ceremony. But the echo of his presence lingered, not in words, but in the posture of every man who'd watched him that day. The frost still lingered on the range gravel the next Saturday, crunching under boots as the first arrivals filed in. The sky hung gray, the kind of heavy cloud cover that promised winter was close. But Cruz was already there, earlier than anyone else, standing near the benches with a small group of fresh recruits. His vest and GoPro were gone. No swagger, no bright performance. Just a plain hoodie, clipboard tucked under his arm, and the calm expression of someone who had decided that this day wasn't about him. Frank's truck rolled in just as it always did, leaving a faint trail of exhaust in the cold air. He parked in his corner, climbed down, and pulled the old rifle case from the bed. Nothing about him had changed, the same jacket, the same cap, the same deliberate pace. Yet the air shifted as he crossed the lot. Conversations quieted, heads turned, not with mockery or curiosity anymore, but with a kind of instinctive respect. Cruz walked forward, his voice low. Lane 7's open. Frank smirked faintly. Imagine that. The recruiter smiled, but without bravado. Got some new shooters today. Told them to watch more than they talk. Frank nodded once, then went to his lane, setting his cloth across the table, laying out the rifle piece by piece. The rhythm of it was like breathing, slow, steady, purposeful. Meanwhile, Cruz gathered the young men under the benches. Their faces carried the tension of the untested, some nervous, some overeager, all of them still carrying the raw edges of youth. Cruz cleared his throat, speaking evenly. You'll hear a lot of rules about shooting, he began. You'll hear about stance, breathing, correction, sight alignment. All of it matters. But the best marksman I've ever seen told me something last week that matters more than all the rest. The recruits leaned closer. It's not about hitting the target. It's about why you're aiming in the first place. The words landed heavier than the cold air, sinking into young minds that had come expecting technique, but received something deeper. Down at lane 7, Frank loaded a single round, chambered it with ease, and fired. The crack echoed, sharp and final. He lowered the rifle, his gaze drifting across the benches where the recruit stood. He didn't speak. He simply gave a slight nod, the kind of gesture that passed more than instruction. It passed responsibility. Cruz caught it. He straightened his shoulders without thinking, like a soldier receiving an unspoken order. From that day forward, the rhythm of the range changed. Frank remained the same, quiet, steady, untouched by ego. But Cruz shifted. He stopped trying to impress the recruits with speed or noise. He guided them with patience, letting Frank's presence speak louder than his own. He stood back when Frank corrected stances, when Frank adjusted a shoulder or showed a young man how to breathe through the trigger pull. The recruits began to treat Frank like something more than an instructor. When he walked past, they instinctively straightened. They stopped filling silence with chatter, stopped asking for stories they didn't need to hear. They watched. They listened. They absorbed. It was the kind of mentorship that couldn't be bought, couldn't be forced. It was given in small, deliberate pieces and received with the weight of reverence. Weeks passed like that, steady as Frank's shooting rhythm, until one morning when Frank opened his mailbox and found an envelope with no return address. Inside, a plain white card, handwriting firm and deliberate. Some of the recruits are graduating next week. We'd be honored if you'd stop by. Nothing fancy, just a small ceremony. We owe you more than you know. No signature, but the handwriting was Cruz's. Frank nearly set it aside. Public gatherings had never been his thing. He had no use for ceremonies, no taste for applause. But the letter stayed in his hand longer than he expected. The words weighted not by duty, but by sincerity. It reminded him of something long buried, when older hands had once guided his own, when someone had told him lessons not written in manuals. The next Saturday, his truck pulled into the lot again. Not for shooting, for something else. Behind the range, folding chairs were set in neat rows. A small podium stood at the front, flags lifting faintly in the wind. Families, friends, and a handful of local veterans filled the space. Nothing fancy, just as the note had promised. The recruits stood in formation, nervous in their fresh uniforms, eyes searching the crowd. Cruz stood at the podium, sharper than usual in his pressed jacket, but his voice when he began was not the voice of the recruiter who had first arrived. It was steadier, grounded, softened by respect. He called each recruit forward, handing out certificates, shaking hands, whispering a quiet word of encouragement to each. Families clapped softly, proud but restrained. Then Cruz paused, his gaze sweeping the crowd. His words came slower now, heavier. There's one more person we need to thank today, he said. Someone who didn't ask to be noticed. Someone who didn't ask for recognition or applause or anything at all. His eyes landed on Frank, who sat in the back row in his faded jacket and cap, looking as out of place as a shadow in sunlight. This man reminded us all that legacy isn't about medals or titles, Cruz continued. It's about humility. It's about skill passed on with respect. It's about service that doesn't end when the uniform comes off. All eyes turned. The recruits shifted, their spines straightening. Crew stepped away from the podium and walked toward Frank, holding a simple plaque. Nothing ornate, just wood and brass, engraved with words that mattered more than decoration. With gratitude for your example, your quiet leadership, and your legacy, the recruits stood, not out of protocol, but because something inside them knew they were in the presence of a man who had truly earned it. Frank's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. He accepted the plaque with the same quiet reverence he gave his rifle. He nodded once. No smile, no words. Just acknowledgement, as if to say this was never about me. Later, as the crowd dispersed and the chairs folded away, Cruz stepped forward again, shaking Frank's hand with both of his own. The grip was firm, not as recruiter, not as subordinate, but as soldier to soldier. "Thank you," he said, his voice stripped bare of pretense. Frank met his eyes, gave the faintest nod, and left without fanfare, the plaque tucked under his arm, the gravel crunching under boots as steady as ever. The evening after the ceremony, Frank sat on the porch of his small house at the edge of town. The sun stretched low, spilling orange and gold across the tree line, the last warmth of the day brushing his weathered face. His old rifle case leaned against the wall beside him, the sniper tab stitched to its side, barely catching the fading light. On his lap rested the plaque he had been given that morning, its polished surface reflecting the fire of the sky. He didn't hold it to admire the engraving. His eyes lingered instead on the back, where a line of handwriting had been added in pen. The strokes were sharp but deliberate, written with care. "Because of you, we aim with purpose." Signed simply, Cruz. Frank let the words sit with him. He leaned back in the chair, listening to the wind tugging through the trees, the slow rustle a reminder that the world kept moving, no matter the noise or the silence. He didn't smile, not fully, but the hardness in his eyes softened. For years he had come to the range alone, carrying nothing but his rifle in the silence that suited him. He hadn't needed acknowledgement. He hadn't needed stories. He had done his duty long ago, and that was enough. But something about the way those young recruits had listened, not for a show, not for entertainment, but for guidance, made him realize that passing it on mattered more than he had thought. He looked down at the plaque once more. Some men left behind medals. Others left behind stories told loudly in bars or written on headstones. Amahashals. He had never cared for either, but legacy, he thought, wasn't something you claimed. It was something carried forward by others. The next weekend, Frank showed up at the range as always. Same dusty truck, same worn rifle case, same lane 7, waiting like an old friend. But the atmosphere had changed. The recruits were already there, lined along the benches, their rifles cleaned, their shoulders squared not with arrogance, but with quiet discipline. Cruz stood with them, clipboard forgotten, his posture calm. He nodded as Frank entered. No words were exchanged, none needed. The nod was enough. Frank unrolled his cloth, laid out the rifle piece by piece, and began his routine. The recruits watched, every motion absorbed as if it were instruction written in the air. When he fired, no one counted the bullseyes. They didn't need to. They watched his breathing, the way he coaxed the trigger, the stillness between each shot. One of the recruits finally asked a question, not about war, not about tours, not about medals, just, "Sir, how do you know when to take the shot?" Frank set the rifle down and looked at the boy for a long moment. Then he answered, voice even, words chosen like rounds from a box. "When you know the reason is worth it." Silence followed, not because they didn't understand, but because they did. The kind of understanding that didn't need to be explained further. As the day ended, Frank packed his rifle case again. Several of the recruits asked if he would return the next week. He gave them the same answer as before. Just a faint nod, nothing more. That was enough for them. Cruz approached as Frank walked past. This time, his handshake was firm, both hands again wrapping around Frank's, the way soldiers thank soldiers. His voice was steady, almost reverent. "We'll carry it forward," he said. Frank didn't answer. He didn't need to. He tipped the brim of his cap and kept walking. Steady as always, his boots crunching on gravel, his silhouette fading into the lowering sun. That night, back on his porch, he leaned against the chair again, rifle case by his side. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying the echoes of the range, the memory of young voices listening instead of speaking, learning instead of pretending. He traced the edge of the sniper tab with one finger, the threads worn but unbroken. He had carried silence for a long time, carried it through jungles, through years, through ranges filled with men who mistook noise for skill. That silence had been enough. But now he realized it wasn't just his anymore. It belonged to them too. The recruits who had watched, the young men who had stood straighter, the ones who now aimed with more than ambition. The plaque rested on the small table beside him, the words on the back etched deeper in his mind than the engraving on the front. Because of you, we aim with purpose. He let the night settle around him, the weight of years balanced against the lightness of knowing his legacy was no longer his alone. Some men left behind medals, some left behind stories. Frank Maddox left behind something quieter, something stronger. He left behind purpose. And for him, that was enough.